to build their worldview around Greek rationalism, but they're focused in derash. Now, what's derash? I'm going to tell you what derash is. I've kind of explained it before. I've got to explain it again. It's critical to understand this, because the whole Old Testament is based in derash thinking. The whole of the Apocrypha is generally based in derash thinking. Guess what the worldview that Jesus Christ, when he talked in the Gospels, was fighting? Derash worldview. Because that's the worldview of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, etc., etc. Right? So, there's a couple of things we need to focus on. A rabbinic focus is when a scripture is mentioned, it's an introductory note. So, for example, if we have a quote from Isaiah in the New Testament documents, what does that mean? You have to go back and look at the context of the entire piece. This is the way the rabbis do it. The rabbis didn't want to spend their time. Remember, they had limitations on the amount of parchment and papyrus and time they had, right? So every time you wrote down a quote, you didn't want to have to quote the whole of the chapter or the whole of the whole, right? So what did you do? You put in a single point, and guess what that did? That points back to the whole that you have to look at. So one of the things where people get in trouble is they basically will go look at a quote, for example, and all the quotes in the New Testament documents are from the Septuagint. So you should be looking at your Septuagint. But in any case, they look at a quote from Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, and what do? They take that quote as a singular piece that means everything that it meant in the text, right? It doesn't. You have to go back and see what the whole context is. Whenever a psalm is quoted, you have to look at the context of the entire psalm. This is really important to note. It's called rabbinic context, and it's the way the rabbis wrote in this time. So if the rabbis wrote this way in the time, what do you think about the Gospels and New Testament documents?
He probably did too.
Right? Yeah. Well, what about old Paul? Old Saul of Tarsus? He was a student of Gamaliel, and he was a rabbi, right? And they called Jesus what? Rabbi. So if you're going to read this, you got to read it within the context it was written. You can't just go making up stuff. Like in English, we do it all the time, right? We think everything in English ought to be in English terms, right? And it's not. In any case, the meaning is already there in the context of the derash. The point is to tease out an entire understanding, and this is the rabbinic view. There's no room in a rabbinic view for multiple understandings. And if you remember, I'll remind you, there's Pishat, Remez, Derash, and Sod. Pishat's a plain literal sense that did not become into focus until around the about 600 to 1000 AD. The Remez allegorical, this was really prevalent during the Reformation period in both Jewish and Christian thought. The derash is that homiletic interpretation to uncover an ethical or moral lesson. This was all the thinking in the Old Testament, in the apocryphal documents, to the New Testament documents, and in fact in Jewish thought until around 600 AD to 800 AD. And Sod is basically the Kabbalist interpretation. So the only way of interpretation, according to the rabbis, before around 800, 600 AD is derash. No, they did not use the plain literal Pishat understanding. So sometimes they'll talk about Pishat versus derash. Did you have a question?
You have to uncover an ethical. Who uncovers it? It's up to
The rabbis do it. And remember, the guys who won were the Pharisees, and so they would say that you use the Mishnah and the Talmudic documents to uncover the understanding for the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah and the Tanakh. That's their view. So a very different viewpoint than we have, because we want to look at it in a Pishat or literal context. Guess where the Greeks want to look at things? How do you think the Greeks look at the world?
Logically.
Literally. Yeah. Well, literal and logic, in my mind, come together. Because literal and logical means that you're in. And by the way, if you have a very concrete, non-euphemistic language, what are you looking at the world as? Literal. Right? Our thinking about human culture got to wrap around this idea. Because the people are not ignorant. They don't lack intelligence or wisdom. They're different, they're motivated differently, they think differently, etc. So people in different cultures do act and think differently. If you don't believe me, go to a different culture. We just had I have a group that I meet with once a month where we have kind of intellectual discussions and intellectual presentations. And the presentation was about Japan. And we had a long conversation, about an hour conversation, about the differences in the culture between Japan and America, between Western and Japanese culture. And, you know, go to Japan if you don't believe me. You'll see an incredibly different culture than ours. And if you miss it, you're not looking. So, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot to see the differences in culture. It's because people are thinking about the world differently, and they see the world differently than we do. Cultures are different. They drive people to do something differently. As a matter of fact, if you haven't noticed, Muslim Islamic cultures are different, aren't they? I don't see you ladies with burqas on today. Okay? The religious focus at the times comes out of that pagan thinking. The world is a fearful and dangerous place. There's no understanding about how things work. The Greeks are just figuring that out. Remember scientific method? They're just figuring that out. The gods are in everything. You have paganism. The pagan man sees spiritual action and forces in everything. And therefore, you got to placate those. So that goes back to the concept of sacrifice. Sacrifice is an important concept. And you say, why does this all fit to literature? Because the way you think is the way you write. Matter of fact, your teachers probably told you. Well, they tell you today, write like you speak. But you speak the way you think, right? That's just a shortcut. In any case, I'll just remind you again, in paganism, we have the Greeks, Romans, and everybody else. Belief is gods and everything. Becomes a pantheon, becomes mystery religion, becomes Gnosticism. So right now, where are we focused in this time in the world? Mystery religion. Mysterion. I don't have time to get into great details about Mysterion. I wish I did. We probably need a whole class on it because what you find in the Gospels is a lot about Mysterion. It's embedded in the culture. But for now, it's good enough just to recognize the pagan worldview of the culture. So Greek is a pagan worldview. Greek literature has a pagan worldview. What about sacrifice? Let's just think about this for a second. The taking of life of anything was viewed as taken from the province of God or gods. In other words, any time that you killed meat, and I've mentioned this before, anytime you killed an animal, you were sacrificing it to the gods. And therefore, you just couldn't eat, you know, hunting. We think of all the ancient world as going out and hunting, right? Guess what? They didn't. As a matter of fact, there are prohibitions today in Orthodox Judaism about hunting. Why? You can't kill the meat in a kosher manner, right? In the ancient world, the same thought held true. So that there are evidences of, for example, there are frenzied hunting things, for example, in some of the cases where they actually went out and ripped animals apart as part of their religious sacrifices. But in general, to eat meat, you had to sacrifice it before the gods. So you had to take it to the temple. By the way, meat is very dear to the people. I've mentioned this to you before. So what we find, one of the dearest commodities in the ancient world is eating meat. And therefore we have words, as I mentioned, like epithumia, which is the desire, the scent of the sacrifice. You can imagine, I think I've used this example before, you know, when mama takes the little kids to the marketplace, they're not begging for toys, they're begging for meat. They might even be begging for gruel. They're in a starvation culture. But in any case, you have laws. We have, you know, in the Jewish thought, we have the Torah. We also have Roman law. Law is literally a means to protect men, women, children, the aged, and handicapped. It requires some level of strength and organization, which only the Romans had. In general, they did not have police forces, but at that time, the Roman law was the freest for women in the world. The rule of law is in development and in ascendancy. And so all of these cultural things fill the voids in the literature, in the writing. Jewish law has laws for individuals, the Noahic and the Mosaic. I talked about the Noahic law, which is the law that applies to Gentiles. The Mosaic law applies to those under the Mosaic covenant, which is Jews. You have laws for society, laws for cleanliness. You have the verbal Torah, which is the Mishnah, and I've mentioned that before. That's not written down at this time. At this time, religion is changing because we've got the mystery religions based on Greek rationalism becoming stronger. They started around 500 BC, and at this time they are in their peak ascendancy. Some would say they're not quite in their overall peak ascendancy because Christianity became the idea of a Greek mysterion that appealed to the Greeks. It isn't a mysterion, but it looks like one. Gnosticism is growing. Matter of fact, I'll say this again. Gnosticism came out of Christianity. Gnosticism is a religion of faith or belief in knowledge as a way to salvation that was promulgated mainly by Christianity in Greek thought. Pretty much the first domino fall. The way you think is the way you write. So we got limited paper, we got high costs, and we got supplies. The writing almost always was about mysticism in the ancient world. You get a few bright spots, guess where we find the most of the bright spots? In Greek literature. Because in the ancient world, what did most people write about?
Gods and goddesses.
Gods and goddesses and other stuff. Well, where did they see these gods and goddesses? Oh, Bhagavad Gita, for example, the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Gilgamesh. How about the myth cycles, the mythos, the Greek myths? What we find in Greek literature is a movement away from this. And remember I told you why. Because we're moving into the stage of Greek rationalism. So therefore, people are writing about histories, the legal historical method, right? They're writing about science, the scientific method. They're writing about philosophy, logic. And Socrates, remember I told you, you have Herodotus and Theodocles, who are basically the progeny, the fathers of the legal historical method. You have Aristotle, who is the father of the scientific method, and you have Socrates that we pretty much attribute to the concept of logic. Although he didn't invent it, we kind of use his death as a marker of the beginning of Greek philosophy, or the epic, the apex of Greek philosophy. In any case, in this period, you know, this is what we're looking at. And we're seeing a huge difference in the Greeks. What do we find in the Gospels and New Testament? Now, it'd be difficult for me, without defining mysticism, for you to understand the difference between mysticism and not. But for example, if I were to write a document about, let's say, the gods, and what the gods did, well, like a myth. Does the New Testament documents look at all like Greek myth? Is Jesus attributed with, for example, creating the heavens? Or is Jesus attributed directly with the harvest? Or blessing the harvest? Or, what's that? He's not, is he? He's not acted as if he's a pagan god, right? It's not a myth cycle we're talking about. They don't use Jesus to explain why the seasons occur. They don't use Jesus to explain why the stars in the heavens are the way they are. That's mysticism. Mysticism is where you are writing, for example, about how the gods interact with mankind, and things in the greater world occur because of that. As opposed to that, what we have is, as I showed before in the veracity class, is we have documents that are eyewitness accounts to what happened when Jesus was on the earth, for example. That's what the Gospels purport to be. Just like Theodocles, just like Herodotus. For example, in Theodocles and Herodotus, there are miracles, there are sacrifices, there's the interaction of the gods, where Theodocles says that the gods obviously intervened to help the Spartans and, defeat Xerxes. That's not considered mysticism. That's his view of history, and that's the way he spun it. But that's very similar to what we find in the Gospels, isn't it? In other words, an eyewitness account with an attribution to why it occurred. Do you see this? So, in any case, what we find is we find the world moving from a mystical viewpoint to a viewpoint that's more of a rational viewpoint,